أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآل محمد.
ثم الصلاة والسلام على آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المظلومين واللعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من يوم عداوتهم إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد. Tonight is our final lecture in concluding this series on Orthodox Islam. I have every night begun with a verse of Quran from Surah Al Imran. I will inshallah translate this verse at the very end of this lecture. I have a lot to cover and I need to complete this tonight, so I will be speaking as rapidly as I can, and I request you for your undivided attention. I began my series with defining the origins of the term Shia and removing misconceptions such as the belief that the majority represents orthodoxy. I showed how the majority in Islam was simply the result of historic, social, political circumstances where most people living in a society simply go along with the policies of the government and the teachings that the government institutes through their schools and their universities and their masajid. It had nothing to do with an original faith or a debate in which Muslims decided which path to follow. And that if those who were the rightful leaders in Islam were dislodged at the very beginning, then this would have had a snowball effect, so that now the majority following the other leaders would have continued along that path and grown into the majority, and the minority who would attach to themselves to the rightful leaders would always remain a minority. I then went on to defend the Shia madhab by raising all those issues that are commonly brought up as accusations against the Shia to prove that they are the heterodoxy and not the orthodoxy. Unfortunately, I never got to discussing the fiqhi issues that I had mentioned, like why Shias do not fold their hands, why they pray on turba, and I did receive several requests to address them. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to do this tonight, but I had made references to books by Dr. Samawi Tajani, and you will find a lot of answers to these in his books. The reason why I recommend his books is because he wasn't just an ordinary Sunni Muslim who embraced the madhab of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. He was a scholar. So when he embraced Tashayyu', he went through the process of questioning all these issues and looking for answers both from Sunni texts and Shia texts. And so his books are very interesting. They're written in a narrative format. He writes his experiences when he went to Iraq. He met with Sayyid al-Khuyi and quizzed him. He went and met Shaykh Baqir al-Sadr and interrogated him. He had some very interesting experiences with, his Sunni brothers. He went to court on one occasion and fought a case on the basis of the Ahlul Bayt's fiqh on marriage and divorce. So he argues with full references from original sources, and that's why I recommended his books. But if reading books is still arduous for us, we can inshallah ask one of our local ulama to dedicate a lecture and address all these issues as well for us. It's something that is very easy to prove that these fiqhi issues do not give validity to saying Shi'as are not Muslims. Now, of all the issues that were contentious and accusations against the Shia, I proposed that, in my understanding, the issue that was most contentious and that was primary in terms of the list of disagreements was the fact that the Shias are anti-Sahaba and that the Shias curse the Sahaba-i-Kiram. And I explained in detail then over several nights why the Shia madhab is not based on the idea of cursing Sahaba or being opposed to the Sahaba just for the sake of. And on some of the nights I tried to explain the contributions of the Muhajirun and Ansar and their services to Islam. But rather what I wanted to show was that there are historic reasons for why an aura of sanctity was created around a large number of fallible beings whose infallibility is not sanctioned for by the Quran as it is for the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. There were political reasons for these, that those who took power later on needed to create this aura of sanctity for those who preceded them, because if their integrity and their leadership was questioned, then now their own authority would come to question as to how did you inherit this leadership. So there were reasons why these sort of things were created and a lot of traditions were forged. And now it became an issue where you cannot question the intentions, the actions, or the adala of the Sahaba. I then went on to explain that if Islam is the final religion according to Muslims, and if Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam is the last prophet, then it is impossible that what happens after this prophet and after this final revelation could have been left to chance, could have been left to the whims and fancies of the community to say, inshallah, they will find the right path. And when we study the history of Islam, we find that the scholars who rose up to prominence and became the leaders of the Muslims in different sciences, whether it was those who became the leaders of the Ash'ari and Mu'tazili school, or whether it was those who became the leaders of the Maliki, Hanafi, Shafi, Hanbali school, or whether it became those who were the experts of tafsir or any other field, they were not vouched for or chosen by any specific unique way in Islam. In many instances, they moved up to that position by happening to be at the right place at the right time, just like it happens in our communities today, isn't it? We are all, in a sense, equal, and if we take those amongst us who, for example, have not had any formal learning in Islam, some of us take a little more interest in reading books, some of us, like talking in public a little more, and you bubble up within the community to this position where people give you some respect and honor and consider your words as being worthy of listening and giving it some weight. But it doesn't mean that that gives it authority necessarily, right? So it is not possible that this being the final religion, the final book, the final prophet, and then now how this will be guided, this ummah, will be left to such chances and social, political, and historic reasons. So it was also inevitable that if Islam was going to survive until the end of time, then at some point it would have to formalize its dogma, it would have to formalize its theology, and the aqidah of Islam would have to be defined at some point in time. But once the original custodians of Islam, once the true heirs of the Prophet and the true keepers of the knowledge of the Quran were marginalized and put aside, and the command of the Prophet that I'm giving you the Quran and my itra, and if you hold on to them, you will never go astray. Once this command was neglected, then now the Muslims had to define the theology themselves. And so they did the best they could. We give them the benefit of the doubt, and we say that based on whatever sources they could find, and driven by their sincerity and their faith and their own understanding, they began defining Islam and what it says about different issues. Issues from predestination and free will. Issues like, is the Quran the eternal word of God, or is it a creation? Is the speech of God created? Issues like causality. From epistemology to eschatology to everything that came up, they had to find answers, and whoever was then able to answer and take that position of a scholar took on that position, and when they disagreed, then groups began forming and differences arose. At first, the pushback, as we saw, was to ask people not to dwell on these things and not to ask questions. Any philosophical question, any theological question was labeled as bid'ah, that don't ask these questions. But it was only so long that you could keep pushing this, because as other cultures became Muslims, they began asking questions, and human curiosity kept demanding what is the answer to these questions. So now we had to find an answer. And because now we were guessing on our own and trying to use the Quran and whatever we can salvage of hadith, opinions began to vary, but there was no one authority who could tell us whether our opinion is right or wrong. So whatever made sense to us, we followed that group. And as a result of that, many different theological schools formed, of which the two most prominent became the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites. Similarly, many schools of fiqh formed as well, of which the government then clamped down and said, we will abolish all the other schools of fiqh, and only these 4 schools of fiqh will be approved by the government and accepted as valid schools of fiqh. There was no rhyme and reason to say why only 4 and not 5 schools. But there were reasons that you can study historically, politically, to say why these 4 were chosen and what contributions they made in fiqh. There is a very interesting khutbah of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, in Nahj al-Balagha, where he talks about knowledge and the keepers of knowledge. And I encourage you to go back and look at these. And he argues this point to say about how one judge will have an opinion and he will disagree with another one, and that person will come back and say, I am right and he is right. And then Imam Ali asks these questions, some really hard questions. He says, where is the fault? Are we saying that the Prophet did not deliver the message properly? Are we saying that Islam is incomplete? In other words, he is leading us to that conclusion that the problem is we came to this assumption that the book of Allah is enough and we don't need the Prophet anymore and we can figure things out. But that proved to be very wrong. Some of those who argue against the Shia madhab, they say that, look, the Ja'fari madhab is not a valid madhab because the Ja'faris follow Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam, and he did not write a book of fiqh the way Imam Shafi and Imam Maliki and Imam Hanafi and others wrote. Now that is a weak argument because the teachings, first of all, from a Shia perspective, Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salam is not an alim like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi. He is a wasi of Rasul, he is an imam, he is a hujjah of Allah, he is divinely appointed through a line and succession and chain all the way to the Prophet. But even if you were to argue he is an alim, his fiqhi opinions exist. Whether he wrote a book or didn't write is not the issue. That is a weak argument. The Shias call it hadith, you can call it his fatwa and his rulings. But there is enough fiqh and rulings and opinions from him and his father al-Baqir alayhi salam to argue for the case of the Ja'fari madhab. Now, I then went on to define the concept of imama in tashayyu, and I particularly delivered a whole lecture explaining the difference between hereditary imama versus monarchy or dynastic rule or nepotism. And I showed that in imama, even though there is a succession from father to son, this has validity in the Quran, and the Quran vouches for one lineage and one line from the time of Adam, and particularly from the descendants of Ibrahim and Ismail, that was chosen by Allah to be guides for humanity. Now, the repercussions of neglecting this lineage, this chosen line of Allah to guide humanity, had a downstream effect not only on the Arabs and the Muslims, but on all of humanity. If society today is godless, it is partly godless because the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam were not given their position and their right. So it did not just affect Arabs and Muslims, it has affected the whole humanity. The proof of this is that when we look at the ahadith related to what the final Imam al-Mahdi, Hujjat ibn al-Hasan, salawatullahi wa salam alayhi, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. We tend to focus on that big battle between good and evil, but when you read the riwayat and the ahadith of what he does after that, there are some amazing and fantastic concepts given to us of where he takes humanity in terms of knowledge and the advancements in science and technology and medicine and so on that he brings forth. And the analogy that is given to us in our hadith is that if you take the letters of the alphabet to be like 28, for example, then everything that humans discover in knowledge up to the time of the Mahdi will be like 2 letters of the alphabet, and he will bring out the remaining 26. That is the kind of ratio of knowledge that comes from the final Imam. If the Imams, because somebody asked me this question yesterday, that if the Imams were given to rule, then what would happen? Would the Mahdi leave a system and then pass away, or would he continue to still live for thousands of years until the world ends? And it is a very interesting question that I can't get into the details of now, but I have spoken about this before as to how the transition from this world to the hereafter is not a sudden one. But the Mahdi alayhi salam opens new portals and new realms and new dimensions for humans that open up the next world to this world. and things like the dead coming to life becomes commonplace, and communicating with those in the other realm becomes common. And so there is a continuity when you look at the concept of raj'at and so on. There's a continuity from this world to the hereafter. And we don't know how it would have played out, but certainly the suffering of humanity today and the godless society we witness would not have been the case if the true heirs of the Prophet had been given their rightful place. Now, I also spoke at length about all the possible arguments for why the Prophet ﷺ would not have appointed a successor, and what are the possible arguments our Sunni brothers and sisters present. And we talked about that. And then I reviewed the major areas of concern that the Shias have with regard to the first three caliphs. I didn't dwell too much on the caliphs after, from Banu Umayyah and Banu Abbas. This is because Muslims, Shia and Sunni, do not call them Rashida. When the Sunni Muslims refer to Khulafa al-Rashidun, they refer to only the first four. Now, if I say to you, for example, maybe this is not a good example, but the very previous chairmen and presidents of this Jamaat will excuse me. It is just an example. My memory is bad. I don't even know who was the president before the last four. But it's an example. If I was to say the last four presidents of this Jamaat were honest men, then what am I saying to you? I'm saying to you that in my opinion, those before them were not honest. Wal-iyadhu billah. Right? So when Muslims said these four are Khulafa al-Rashidun, then what are you saying? Why isn't Muawiyah one of the Khulafa al-Rashidun? Why isn't Yazid one of the Khulafa al-Rashidun? And this is a question obviously to the Salafis. So the writing is on the wall. I don't think I need to spell it out. So Muslims are not arguing whether Yazid and Mutawakkil deserve to rule. But they do argue, and they do have this contention and this dispute amongst themselves, Shia and Sunni, with regards to the early caliphs. And this has been a source of conflict for us as Muslim brothers for centuries. And so I tried to, as respectfully and as sincerely as possible to my Sunni brothers and sisters, talk about these issues and where the Shia perspective is and why we disagree with the policies and governments of the early Khilafah. And this was in the hope of seeking to understand and to be understood. Now, along with all this discussion, we emphasized that when the rightful Imams were dislodged from their position in Islam, of all the things that caused harm to Islam, the greatest damage in terms of aqeedah was the misunderstanding that came to Muslims in the concept of adala, or justice. So when imama was lost, this issue of adala came up, which is why the Shia introduce it in their usuluddin and talk about adala and imama. From the belief that there is no causality or cause and effect, to the belief that God does evil, but He cannot be judged for being unjust, to the belief indoctrinated in Muslims that God appointed the caliphs and therefore it is God's will that they rule over us, to the belief that the Prophet ﷺ sanctioned the rule of unjust tyrants and said that there will come people who will not follow my seerah and will be devils in human forms, but you must accept them, and even if they whip you, you must obey them and listen to their commands. To the belief that being unjust does not disqualify the imamat of an imam, right down to the person leading the salat does not have to be adil, and by extension the Sahaba, who is anybody who saw the Prophet in his lifetime even once as a Muslim, are all without exception adil, to the idea that books of hadith collected are all authentic and the most authentic under the heavens and only second to the Quran. All these ideas that come under this umbrella of adala proved to be the single greatest cause of devastation to Muslim ideology. This is the point that I have been trying to share. Why? Because it allowed corrupt Muslim leaders and rulers to argue and justify and legitimize their rule, and to say that they are no longer accountable, and that merely by taking authority by force, they are now legitimate ulil amr, and people of authority over Muslims, and that they could now use the wealth of the ummah as their personal wealth and as their personal treasure to spend as they want. And finally, these concepts then opened the doors to radical elements who could now exploit Islam and misinterpret the Quran to commit acts of terror. Now, I must concede that any other Shia speaker or a Shia alim who would have taken up this subject of Orthodox Islam, they would have quite likely argued that the one principle that is missing in Orthodox Islam is wilaya. That would have been the argument, my guess is, for most Shia ulama. And they would have gone into the detail of explaining in the Quran this concept of wilaya, what is wali, who is mawla, and the ayat of innama waliyukumullah. And then they would tie it beautifully to the climax at Ghadir, where the Prophet says, man kuntu mawlahu, and what that mawla means, fahada aliyun mawla. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The reason I chose adala and imama instead of wilaya, it was intentional, because even though the concept of wilaya is very much there in Islam, and you can talk about wilayatul faqih, you can talk about wilayat takwini, wilayat tashri'i, and so on, it is my understanding that this concept of wilaya is still somewhat alien and foreign to our Sunni brothers and sisters in comparison to the idea of adala and imama. And I was trying to, present something with this in mind, that my audience is Shia and Sunni. And that is why I chose the idea of adala and imama, but you could talk of it in terms of wilaya. I then went on to show that after the early dynasties came to an end, the Banu Umayyah and the Banu Abbas, the idea of a khilafah changed to the idea of a sultanate, and the Ottomans ruled for a while. And in time, this khilafat came to an end after the First World War, and it was now replaced by nation states. A lot of the backwardness and lack of foresight in Muslims came through these, the Sultanate and the Ottoman Empire. We talked about how they were opposed to the use of printers, how they were opposed to learning the language of foreigners, how Muslims were prohibited to migrate to the lands of quote-unquote infidels. And these sort of things kept Muslims behind in technology, behind in science. And when the Europeans and the Western powers exceeded the Muslims in weapon building, in technology, they translated everything the Muslims had in their language, they naturally took the position of leadership and authority. Now, Muslims, of course, were broken up into nation states, and they didn't have that umbrella of khilafah, but they still psychologically saw themselves as one ummah, just like they do today, because they had the Quran to hold them together, they had the Arabic language to hold them together, and they had practices such as the Hajj that brings all the Muslims around the world together. So now, because this idea that we are still an ummah continued and endured, various individuals now rose with the idea that we're going to either revive Islam or reform Islam. And so now we began talking about reformers versus revivalists. And we said the reformers believed that the only way forward was to take now what the Westerners had contributed to science and technology and modernization and civilization, and bring those Western ideas into Islam, and then reform Islam. The revivalists, on the other, argued that the problem was we need to return to Orthodox Islam, to original Islam. And so now this fight between the reformers and revivalists, who are called the modernists and the fundamentalists, became a repeat of the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites, where you had one group that was arguing on the basis of reason and downplaying the importance of Quran and trying to use aql and science and modern and technology. And then you have the backlash to that, where you have the literarists who insist on Quran, Hadith, and just do as the Prophet did and keep away anything outside Islam because it is foreign and it will pollute original, pure Islam. And these cycles continued. So we talked about India, we talked about the Middle East, we talked about modernists like Sir Sayyid and Muhammad Abdu, we talked about the more fundamentalists like Maududi, Abu Ala Maududi, and Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, and Sayyid Qutb, and Muhammad Rida, and Rashid Rida, and so on and so forth. Now, the Ahlul Bayt's vision of Al-Amru Bayn Al-Amrayn, that there is a middle course to all this, that you don't need to forsake the Quran for the sake of reason, or you don't need to forsake reason for the sake of Quran, was never being heard. Why? Because the majority of the Muslims continue to believe that the Ahlul Bayt is the household of the Prophet. We need to revere them, we need to respect them, we need to take spirituality from them, but their aqidah and their fiqh was not given importance. It was considered to be something that the Rafida, the heretics, the small sect that has broken away from Islam, they give it importance, but it has no validity in Islam. In the meantime, Muslims began migrating to the lands of non-Muslims. They began living there, adopting the culture. Their children were being born there, and several generations were now adopting the values there. When Muslims came to the land of the non-Muslims, particularly lands where the majority were Christians, they found a different set of issues and different sets of challenges. They found, for example, that in these lands, the religion didn't play an important role. There was a separation of church and state. People don't talk about God and religion so much. Science has a domination over religion. Atheism is given credibility, and people are given a voice to talk about agnosticism and atheism. Now, I was speaking about this yesterday, and someone asked me this question and said, I think you are being a little unfair to science in suggesting that when you push science, even it at some point is basing its arguments on faith, and it is not as exact and precise and methodical and able to prove everything it argues as it claims to. And so we had a bit of a conversation. Let me re-summarize my position of what I'm trying to say. I concede and I accept that faith cannot prove everything in a laboratory. It cannot tell you everything in proof based on the five senses. In a series of lectures that I did many years ago, and I don't even remember what series that was, I gave an example from a Greek philosopher called Plato. It's called Plato's cave analogy that many of you know about. Very quickly, in this analogy, the idea was that imagine that humans are all born in a dark cave. And from the time they're born, they are chained. And there is a sunlight outside the cave that falls into the cave, and because of that, it throws shadows on the wall of the cave. Now, all that human beings have as reality are the shadows that they see on the cave. And based on that, they now start coming up with theories of what the world of reality looks like. And they come out with principles and their science and their beliefs. And this is the truth to them. And they come to the conclusion that reality is only what we can sense with our five senses, what we can observe, and what we understand with our mind. And it is what we see in these shadows before us. They have no concept and idea that there is a world outside this cave and that there is a sun. Now supposing one of those individuals breaks his shackles and walks out of the cave and goes out and looks at the real world and looks at the sun and understands where those shadows are coming from. And then comes back and tells those people that I have seen reality, and reality is not what you think it is. You are chained in a cave in darkness. There is a whole world out there, and there is a reality, and there is a sun that is casting this light, and what you are seeing is only shadows. They would all laugh at him and say, where is the proof? Because they don't see it with their five senses, and they can't prove it with their aql. Now here, a few people might believe this individual on the basis of faith, but what will they rely on? They will rely on the integrity of this individual, that this individual is sadiq and amin. He has never lied. And therefore, if he is saying this, it must be true. Furthermore, supposing there were others who broke out of the cave and went and saw that and came back and said the same thing. And these two were not talking to each other, they came at different times. And 124,000 of them came, and all of them had the same consistent story. Then those who have faith cannot prove their faith based on five senses and observation, but it gives them that conviction that people coming at different ages and different times are saying the same consistent thing. So there must be some truth to them. Now those in the cave can continue arguing that there is no sun. Here I'm using God as an analogy for the sun. But those who have faith are resting it on the integrity of those who went out and saw it. Now, the way you would shatter the faith of those people, if you were one of those scientists who was chained and you came up with theories and firmly believed on those shadows and you promoting that as reality, the way you can demolish those who have faith is to cast doubt on those who went out and came back and spoke. You create suspicion on their integrity. And this is exactly what happened with the Anbiya of Allah. When you look at the Bible, you see a lot of prophets being disparaged. Prophets like Lut and Nuh and Moses and Jesus and so on. Which is why we have been arguing that we cannot take everything in Bukhari and Muslim as Sahih. The response to that I got was that the terrorists are misinterpreting the Quran. They're not using Bukhari and Muslim. But my argument was, what picture of our Prophet is it painting to a non-Muslim who reads about the Prophet? Because now we cannot prove our faith in a lab. So our faith of the hereafter, of God, that there is life after death, that there is day of judgment, is resting on the integrity of Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. But if the book that is the most authentic after the Quran is portraying him as a man who forgets, or who lies, or breaks his oath, na'udhu billah, or cheats, or commits acts of violence, or this most authentic book talks of Moses punching the angel of death and knocking his eyeball out and running through the town naked after his clothes and so on and so forth, then now you are demolishing the people who have gone out of the cave and come back to tell us the truth. So now the source that we can rely on is now gone. So this is the perspective from which we are arguing. Now, I also mentioned that whereas previously the scientists who went looking for inventions were driven by faith and they were the most faithful and religious, things have changed, and whereas science was inspired by religion, now it is motivated by atheism. And as a result of that, a new God has emerged in our lives. And this new God is the human ego, the egoic self, so that humans now don't worship idols or science, but they worship themselves. Now, there is a very nice article on a website called muslimmatters.org. And this article is by a convert Muslim called Imam Mikael Smith. He is a Sunni Imam. The article is called How Liberal Alliances Will Destroy Islam. And it was published in July of this year. And I want to quote some of his passages here. He was a Christian, and he says, when I was a child as a Christian, we used to read the Lord's Prayer. And in the Lord's Prayer, it starts with, Our Father who art in heaven, and so on, right? And in that prayer, it says, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. He says that what has happened is that originally the righteous had this idea when they said, let thy will be done on earth as it is on heaven. The idea was to say that whatever, my Lord, is your will in the heavens, let that will happen on this earth. But what has happened now is it has reversed to say, let thy will be in heaven as it is on the earth. In other words, you, God, now change things up there the way we change it down here, because we have improved on your religion. And so now there is a shifting where the sacredness of authority, the sacredness and authority of revelation to men, So there is a shifting now so that the sacredness and authority has moved from revelation to man and his own will. He says there is a shift from the idea of a revealed truth of a transcendent being to what we might call self-evident truth of our collective society. Remember, we talked yesterday about this idea of we don't need God or religion, we can use collective reasoning to find the truth. So, according to the public discourse narrative, these truths are self-evident and therefore primarily rooted and discovered by reason. And this is the sort of argument that is being presented, that if there is any truth, we can find it by reason. We don't need some transcendent being or revelation to tell us what the truth is. As if God is only echoing what our minds already have the ability to reach. The touchstone of our contemporary morality is that the primacy of the individual's rights is rooted in reason. Individual rights rooted in reason has claimed sacredness for itself. In other words, we have made our reasoning sacred instead of revelation. Now, man has taken the crown of sacredness away from revelation and placed it on his own head. That what this produces is now sacred. All that he thinks, feels, says, and expresses is sacred. In doing so, he made himself the ultimate authority above which there is no other. Truth, justice, equality, and freedom are all liquid and plastic, because now I will define what is truth. And I would take it a step further and say even gender is now liquid and plastic. You can decide whether you want to be called a man or a woman. You've heard of all this debate, right? There was even a push to say that even if someone decides he doesn't want to be called male or female and wants to be called it, you have to call him it. It said that. Otherwise, he can take you to court. Right. Now, suggesting appropriateness or inappropriateness of another person's conduct becomes inappropriate and unacceptable in the society and in this liquid world. Who are you to tell me that what I am doing is wrong? So it is this perfect analogy of the community is sailing in a boat, and I'm going to dig a hole in my side of the boat, and it's none of your business to tell me why I'm digging a hole here. Right? If you're not happy with it, you can reinforce your side of the boat or dig a hole in your side of the boat, but this is my side of the boat, and I will do as I please. Now, we then began playing this politically correct game where we say things, but deep down we know we are lying. Right? We falsify things, we get together for maybe interfaith dialogue, we make public statements in the media, we talk about, terrorism is not caused by religion, it's caused by politics, it has no faith, it has no religion, but we're not willing to acknowledge that there are people who are using faith and misinterpreting it. Right? So we say what we know people want to hear on social media, in public, everywhere, because we know if we say otherwise, it's not politically correct, and there will be a backlash and people will come down on us. But deep down in our nafs, the way we talk about women, the way we talk about society, the way we talk about right and wrong, justice, peace, war, we know we are lying. But this is the game. So as we lie, we begin to believe that lie, and then we live that lie as human beings. Now, there's a very interesting book that I once saw, and if you're interested, you can look at it. It's got a title that could mislead you. The title of the book is called God is Not One, The 8 Rival Religions That Run in the World, and it's by a university scholar called Stephen Prothero. And it's not what it seems to be. He's not trying to prove that there are multiple gods. But his argument when he says God is not one is, he says, we have this game where we play and we talk about pluralism and we say all religions are good and all religions are right and all lead to the same path. But he says when you actually look deep down, they are not the same. How can 2 religions be the same when one of them is telling you unless you believe Jesus is the Son of God, you will never find salvation, and the other one is telling you it is absolutely blasphemous to believe Jesus is Son of God. Right? So he digs out the differences in a very nice manner and says the reason we say this now in society, all is good, it's all fine, we're all on the right path, it's all different spokes of a wheel leading to the same center. This is just political correctness. It is not the truth. Now, Islam defines liberation not as freedom of the self, but rather freedom from the self. And the only way you free yourself from the self is by surrendering to the will of a higher being. The ego does not liberate you. It enslaves you because its very root is false and an illusion. What happens when your soul leaves your body and you realize on the Day of Judgment that you are nothing but a ray emanating from one of the attributes of God, and that you have no essential reality of your own? At that point, where is the value of all your arguments and your actions on the basis that this is my right and my freedom and I reserve the right to act as I want and decide what I want and do as I please? So, I haven't had a chance to speak about the present day Muslims, but very quickly alluding to an example. Take for example, I'm coming back to this whole discussions of how because of taking this attitude and leaving the right guides, now Muslims keep flip-flopping between this modernism and being enamored by Western values and being very rigid and being extremists. Take for example the Arab Spring, which happened in 2011. A lot of countries were affected by this, but one of the countries where this happened the most in its most prominent sense was Egypt. And I remember when this was happening, every evening I'd sit with my family and we'd watch the Muslims gather at that square. Was it Tahrir Square? I can't remember, right? Millions and millions and millions of Muslims gathering. Ashab, yurid, isqat al-hukuma, ashab. And I kept looking at that stage that was empty, and I'd say to my family, until they find, it doesn't matter they're millions, until they find a leader on that stage who is charismatic and who can hold them, this is not going anywhere. This is going to get manipulated and puppets will be set up and it will go back to as it was before. And they went night after night, week after week, and different people came forward to speak, but nobody could hold that position of leadership. The modernists and reformists were able to overthrow Hosni Mubarak, but they could not present a candidate. Eventually what happened? They put forward a man called Muhammad Morsi, who presented himself at first as a moderate because he went around with a suit and a tie. But soon it became obvious that he had Salafi inclinations. And he brought the Salafi back to power. And in 2013, he went to a stadium on stage with Salafi clerics who delivered speeches. One of them went out and said the Shias are filthy. Another went out and said the Shias are kafir and should be killed. As a result of that, a lot of the Shias in Egypt faced the hate and the backlash to that. And eventually he was removed and sentenced to die, and all these things happened. So what we learned from this is that without right leadership, Muslims will always swing from one side to the other, from trying to modernize to being extremists. But they will never find that path of moderation, that path of al-amru bayn al-amrayn, where scripture is primary but it does not oppose aql. Now, the Salafis of course have a lot of resources, a lot of wealth. So they are trying to take the position where they should speak for Islam. The rich Arabs in the Middle East in the meantime and in the Gulf are still in Disney mode. So while the rest of the world are trying to fight human trafficking and poverty and environmental issues and suffering and hunger and disease, they are still trying to impress the world with the fact that they have gold-plated cars and they have the tallest buildings. And, there is that sense of, our fireworks are better than yours and our buildings are taller than yours and we can build an indoor ski resort and we build the first underwater hotel. And the idea in their little minds is that we must still impress our colonial masters. We'll build the whole city of Venice in our city in the desert and show them that we love you so much, you don't have to imitate us, but we will certainly bring you here. So when you miss home, you can travel from Venice and come to our land and visit Venice again. Now, whose wealth are they using to do this? They are exploiting the wealth of the Muslims as their personal wealth. Imagine if these Muslims would have sat and thought and said, let us build the best universities in the world. Their argument was what? Oil is going to run out. We want to put ourselves on the map and we're going to do it with tourism. What if they would have built the best universities in the world? What if they would have built the best hospitals in the world? They would have still had the fame they crave for. But Muslims would have been in a position of nobility. Muslims would have been in a position of authority. You see, the world has learned the secret to how you become the superpower. A lot of people talk about, well, America is in decline and the next superpower is going to be India, it's going to be China. Let me let you on a secret. This is my perspective. You don't become a superpower by having the most powerful economy, or having the most wealth, or having the biggest army, or having the best weapons. You become a superpower by having the best brains, having the best intellect in your society. You drain brain from other countries, and that is why you will see with all the problems that the United States have, biggest of which is the leader, they are still seen as a superpower. Why? Because a lot of their minds are actually immigrants. You will see Canada doing the same thing. They have a very nice, aggressive immigration policy where they welcome people, but when you look at the criteria, when you apply to move to Canada, what do they check and what do they ask for more? Your education, your work experience. They want your brains. You come and study here at a university, you study for 5 years, whatever, they don't want you to go back. After you've studied enough number of years in the UK, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, they'll give you citizenship. Why? Because whoever holds the best minds, they are the leaders in the world. And you look at the history of all superpowers before, whether Iraq when it was Babylonia, Ethiopia was a superpower once, Persia was a superpower once, Rome was a superpower once, China was a superpower once, Muslims were a superpower once. Any land that was a superpower, they had the best brains. And people have caught on that. They will not let the Arabs have the brains and have the best hospitals and have the best universities and have the best schools, which is why you'll see with all their advancements, when their kings and royal family are sick, they still come to the US for medicine and medical. So they may laugh at Iran or India, that look at the cars they invent, look at the laptops and look at the cell phones, how humble they are. But they cannot invent even cereal. That also has to be imported. So a lot of times Muslims and Arabs take pride in what Muslims contributed in the past, and that was a golden age and a glorious age. It wasn't a glorious and a golden age. It was ruled by tyrants and dictators. Those who were glorious were individual scientists. A lot of them were persecuted by the governments of their times. When was the last time we saw inventions coming out from the Arab lands? And what was it that they have exported to the world that was useful besides oil? So even when the oil that they export to the world, they have to bring the Americans to come and drill the oil for them. And then when they get paid the money, they go buy arms from them. And then when they've bought the arms, they say, now you come and use it for us, because we don't know how to use it. If we want to go and oppress and bomb Yemen, we'll bring mercenaries from South America. If we want to go and oppress the Shia in Bahrain, we'll bring Pakistani mercenaries and come and fight them, right? Whether it's lack of knowledge, whether it's lack of courage, whether it's the idea that our blood is precious, whatever it may be, there are two sets of rules for those who call themselves the Khadim of Haramain and the Khadim of the Ummah. There is a rule for their own royalty that can go out and commit the most heinous, unchaste activities, and they are above the law. And then there is a law for the layman, where you steal bread, we will chop your hand off. What I'm trying to say is, we as Muslims, Shia and Sunni, cannot let them speak for Islam or for us. We are now left as Shia and Sunni to figure out the way forward on our own. The solution does not lie with the Saudis. The solution for Shias and the solution for Sunnis lies with Al-Azhar. And the solution for the Shias lies with Qum and Najaf. And if we can unite these two, Al-Azhar and Najaf and Qum, then wonderful things begin to happen. Today, when people publish a book that says 500 of the most influential Muslims in the world, or 100 most influential Muslims in the world, and you look at the pictures on the cover, you will see some Shia figures and you will see some Sunni figures. The Shia figures you will see is Ayatollah Sistani, Ayatollah Khamenei. Go look it up. Google this, 500 most influential Muslims or whatever. The Sunni figures you will see, however, are the kings and the princes of different lands. Why isn't the head of Al-Azhar's picture on that cover? This is what we are asking for. So I want to start drawing towards a conclusion, but I still need to cover some ground. You will bear patience with me. I have exceeded my time every single night. This is not with a sense of entitlement, but because of the subject I've chosen, and because it's not good to break your sunnah, I will exceed tonight as well. But bear patience with me, inshallah, if you can recite a salawat ala Muhammad. Some of it is disjointed, but I'm trying to cover as fast as I can. I have something to say to those who see themselves as revivalists in Islam today, and others call them fundamentalists. The problem with fundamentalists is when they argue about a very literal, extreme, fundamentalist type of Islam, it becomes a cult-like mindset. And typically when you look at these extreme groups, they have one leader that they look up to as the only person they're going to listen to. They put on blinkers, and their narrative and truth will only come from this person. Whatever he tells us to do, we will only listen to him. We will not listen to anyone else unless he tells us to listen to him. And so when you take the idea of only one man as your group leader, whether you are Shia or Sunni, it becomes dangerous. I spoke last night of Sheikh Ahmad Ahsahi. Sheikh Ahmad Ahsahi was not just a Sayyid or a Sheikh, he was a Mujtahid, but he misled an entire group of people, thousands, right? So you look at the Wahhabi movement, it rests on Ibn Taymiyyah and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. If we are not careful, and if you as a Shia or a Sunni find yourself in this position where you follow a small group that insulates it from society and follows and listens to just one individual, and he is your only source of truth, then you have taken an extreme view and become a fundamentalist, even if it is not violent, and that will not lead to any good. When you look at the history of such groups, what you will see is that one individual who's the charismatic leader will eventually either leave or die. When he dies, he will be succeeded by another leader who will not be as charismatic. He will be 50 to 60% as charismatic. And when he dies, then the following one will be even less. And eventually the group will be rift with scandals, with misappropriation of wealth, with all sorts of problems. And it will be a misguided group. So these sort of things have not come from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Particularly for Shias, there is absolutely no room for this sort of an extreme mindset. The Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam are the only ones that we would follow with that level of subservience. But not following an ordinary human being with that sort of an idea that only his opinion and, he is our leader. Now I want to say something to the modernists who see themselves as reformists. The Quran praises aql. And it says in the Quran in many places that we are relating these signs for ulil albab, for those who have intellect. Many, many, many verses. It invites people to reflect and ponder on its verses. But the problem with relying on your intellect alone is that the mind is prone to providing multiple perspectives. And it can fall prey to analogies, even if it's reading, and even when it reads and tries to understand divine scripture. Now, to avoid man's intellect taking the wrong path, the Quran tries to explain the same concept multiple times in different places. So one of the ways you can resolve whether your mind is interpreting the Quran right is by taking a holistic understanding of the Quran and seeing whether there is any contradiction in your understanding of a particular verse. But man's intellect is only a guide. The scripture must continue to mentor the intellect of man to make sure he is thinking aright and to avoid any diversions and pitfalls. If we say the power of intellect has to stay subservient to scripture, to Quran, it is only because it is the Quran which will anchor the aql towards Allah. Man can sail to new heights of spiritual realizations through the ship of the intellect and can avoid the danger of drifting away from the right path to where Allah is to be found. But it must always be anchored and harnessed by the Quran and the authentic ahadith. Now, these ahadith, of course, must concur with what the true guides have taught. So what we are saying here is that your aql can be your ship, but your compass has to be the Quran. It must guide and be the yardstick that guides us in deciding what is right and being wrong. A lot of times what we are seeing in our community is that this idea of a reformer is that I will listen to all the different opinions I can get from people in my community, and then I will decide and pick and choose what makes sense to me. Right? That is absolutely the wrong way to go about it. What we first need to do is understand what is the original teaching of Islam. What is it that the Quran and Hadith actually says, and not simply arrogantly assume that just because I don't understand Arabic, there is nothing in the 14 centuries of knowledge that has been passed down in my faith that is worth a second look. Right? So we can't just use our aql and look at the Quran high level and read an English translation and then come up with theories of how the community needs to reform and move forward. There is no room for this sort of, free thinking. And as we said yesterday, there are labels from other belief systems that are thrown at us, like justice, human rights, and you're put on the defensive to defend these things. Are Muslims just? Do Muslims give women their rights? And you're now trying to defend this in a free thinking manner, using your own understanding and just what you can read in English of the Quran and a few books of your choice. Now, look at the reformers before you. We mentioned some before. Why have past reformers failed and why have some succeeded? If you look at reformers who succeeded, like Ayatollah Khomeini, for example, and you look at reformers who failed, what is the difference? You will see that the reformers who failed, where they went wrong is they were trying to ask for reform in a vacuum. They were using their own thinking and a few books they have read and then proposing change. The whole Shia argument is that whatever you propose as reform and original or orthodox Islam, it must prove itself as to how it connects to Allah and Rasul and Quran and the Imams. If you cannot show us that connectivity, then it doesn't give us that conviction that your reform has any validity in Islam. And so when we emphasize the need to follow the ulama, the traditional ulama, the maraji, it is because they have that connection. They have devoted their lives to studying the teachings of the Imams, and through them, then we have an understanding of what the Imams taught and what the Prophet taught and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is not this idea that we have this sort of pseudo-intellectualism and we just now, love to talk about spirituality and philosophy, and Sharia is not important to us. We downplay the Sharia, and now we are big in talking about how we need to change as a community and how Islam needs to improve. Think about this for a moment. Why did I take the trouble over these 12 nights to talk about the early Khilafat and talk about the Sahaba and talk about Bukhari and Muslim? I could have just gone and talked about present Muslims. The reason I did this is because before I can suggest any changes to our Sunni brothers and sisters, I first had to convince them that the condition that the Muslim community is in now, how does it come about and how does it relate to what was originally taught by Allah and His Messenger? It is only when I was able to show that connectivity, that relevance to history and how it evolved, that now some of them might look back and realize and say, well, that makes sense. So that history and that hierarchy and connection is very, very important. Reform is not a problem in itself. In fact, reform cannot be rejected. If we reject reform only because we are afraid it will dilute our faith, then we will stagnate as a community and we will become fundamentalists. The solution, however, the problem, however, is not in what we say should reform, but how we go about the reform process. How do we ensure that the reforms we are proposing in our community will not lead to deviation, to isolation, and to serious consequences? And this is only possible when we are able to push reform while staying faithful to the original teachings of our faith, to what the Imams taught us, to what these custodians and ulama are giving us as the teachings of the Imam and the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Unless we are firmly rooted in that, we will not be able to propose any meaningful changes as reforms. So the Sharia, for example, cannot be put aside for a new set of laws. Or we cannot downplay the Sharia and say, let's just interpret it symbolically and let's talk about being more spiritual and more intellectual. I want to now address my Sunni brothers and sisters as a conclusion and say to them, and then I want to address my Shia brothers. For my Sunni brothers and sisters who have been listening to me for the last 12 nights, I want to say to them, look at the socio-political historical circumstances of how the Sunni madhahib was formed. You will see that it was not, in a sense, very different from how philosophies were formed or how science evolved. Why I say this? You will see that opinions were formed, discoveries were made, teachings came about from individuals who happened to be in the right place at the right time through constant discovery and constant evaluation. But if we argue that this religion is final, and this prophet is final, and this book is final, then this cannot be the way to go about discovering the truth and arguing the truth. Because Allah would not have left things to chance if He is not going to send any more guides. And therefore we need to look at these things and say that what came about through historic coincidence and what came about really from Allah and His Messenger. Even if you study the history of idol worship, you will see a lot of it is just historic accidents because of which it led to that. I have done a tafsir of Surah Nuh in which I have explained this, so I will not go into this. Now, very few quick points. Muslims as a majority have suffered tremendously through history. First of all, they were ruled by dictators and tyrants. Those who should not have been given positions of authority were given positions of authority. The Shias as a minority were consistently persecuted through the ages. A lot of authentic ahadith was lost because hadith was banned and its recording was prohibited. Muslims were told by the Prophet to hold onto the Quran and Itra, and if you hold onto them, you will not go astray. But they failed to live up to this. Yes, they love the Itra, but if the Prophet says you will not go astray, then what does he mean? Not going astray will not come about by simply loving them. It will come about by following them. And if the Prophet says these two will not separate until the Day of Judgment, then Muslims need to take hold of this again. We have seen that Islam is being used as synonymously with violence and terrorism. We do play the political correctness game and say it has nothing to do with Islam. But I talked about Sayyid Qutb, I talked about fundamentalism. There is a point at which we need to stop and take accountability and say there are things that are being exploited and misused in Islam, and we need to address those. The doors of ijtihad has been closed for the majority of Muslims with an insistence that there are only 4 schools, but there is no Islamic proof to say there should be only 4 schools. This is another area that Muslims are looking at and need to look at it. And finally, we have allowed literalists to tell us, don't ask questions, it is bid'ah, don't study kalam, don't study philosophy, and so on and so forth. And now as a backlash as well, we have reformists who are allowing people who are unqualified to water down faith and present a new form of Islam. So it is time now to look at this sincerely and say that if this is the final religion, who are its true custodians and who are its true guardians? Where does true knowledge lie? Who are those that the Quran calls as the ummah from Ibrahim and Ismail that was as submissive to Allah as they were? That I mentioned, ummatan min dhurriyatina ummatan muslimatan lak. Who is this khayra ummah? Who is this ummatan wasata? For whom does the Quran vouch tahara and isma? Who are the rasikhuna fil ilm? Who are those ahl al-dhikr that you need to ask questions to when you do not know the answer? Who are that qurba for whom we were asked to have an active love and a mawadda? And who is this itra that the Prophet said, if you hold on to them, you will not go astray? So we need to shed these naive ideas that say, for example, that the Prophet said, all my Sahaba are adil, and that, a book that was compiled by a fallible being is all sahih, or that if an unjust person rules over you, you need to keep quiet over the tyranny and injustice. These sort of things need to go, and it is really something I'm saying very candidly. If we have built an edifice for centuries, and if we say we can't shake these pieces and books because the Sharia will collapse, we must ask this question, that if this edifice was built by fallible beings, and the Quran does not vouch for them, would we be committing a sin if we reopen the doors of ijtihad, and we reopen the discussions on kalam, and we leverage the sincere ulama we have even in Sunni Islam to acknowledge what went wrong in Islam and where it needs to be fixed? So the first point to fix anything wrong in Islam is to acknowledge we have a problem. And then after we acknowledge we have a problem, then we look for ways to heal. And my proposal throughout this series was to say to my fellow Muslims, take a look at the concept of imama and adala that tashayyu has to offer, and see what it offers in terms of reviving and reforming Islam to the Orthodox Islam that we want. And if we can do that, then that will be true Salafism. And that will be the real original Islam, and not the superficial changes we make of changing how we dress and how we look and how we rename our names and say now our names should be, this and that. I want to say as a final words to my Sunni brothers and sisters, the Shias are not your enemies. Trust me, we love seeing you in our masajid, and we love seeing you praying besides us. And this is our hope and ambition, that we can come to the masajids that you maintain and pray besides you with our turbas as well. And that we remove that idea of Shia masjid, Sunni masjid. Inna masajida lillah. There should be no fear that if I go into this masjid, I will be thrown out. Right? We need to know that our enemies love to pitch us against each other. And if you read the news, you will see they keep using the word Shia, Sunni to divide us. This year, in the month of Ramadan, the year 2007, when the Quds rally was taking place, I saw this myself in a prominent newspaper. The headlines of the paper read, Shia Iran rallies in protests against Sunni Saudi Arabia. First of all, Saudi Arabia is not Sunni. Saudi Arabia is Salafi. Secondly, my question is, the majority of Palestinians are Sunni. So why is Shia Iran rallying against Sunni? Where are you getting this from? So this is the kind of things that are being used against us. And we need to think about this. I want my Sunni brothers and Muslims to reflect on two verses of the Quran. There is a verse in chapter 9, verse 33 that says, هُوَ الَّذِي أَرْسَلَ رَسُولَهُ بِالْهُدَى وَدِينِ الْحَقِّ لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ. He it is who sent the Prophet with guidance and the right religion, that it may prevail over all other understandings of religion. When will this happen? Do you see this happening with the current understanding of Islam that Muslims have? And in chapter 24, verse 55, Allah promises those who have faith and says, وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ لَيَسْتَخْلِفَنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ كَمَا اسْتَخْلَفَ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ. That He will make you the inheritors of the earth as He made those before you. And that He will fortify your religion for you, and that you will come to a point where you will live without fear, and that none shall be worshipped on the earth except me. How is this going to come about? If you reject the idea of an infallible being and a guide from God who guides humanity to this, do we have any guide today that can fulfill these verses of the Quran? And in all honesty, even if Muslims continue like this for another 500 years, do you ever see that happening? Now to my Shia brothers, very quickly. We ignore the fact that we live in a materialistic society, and we ignore the fact that our values are now the values of society. It has become harder and harder for us to argue against the society's definition of what is just, what is not just, what is human rights, what is not human rights, what is freedom, what is not freedom. Those of us living in the West know this. It is now harder for you to condemn, for example, gay marriages. It is harder for you now to condemn promiscuity. It is harder for you to condemn the use of substances. Truth, right, wrong, justice is now free for all. It is very individualistic. So at an individual level, we need to take our deen more seriously. We as Shias are sitting on a gold mine. We have the best leaders, we have the best guides in the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. How do we emulate them and come closer to them? We will not come closer to them merely with fada'il and masaib and saying that anything you do in the name of Imam Hussein is okay. I'm being very open and blunt. These forms of extremism in Masaib of Imam Hussein, that is unspeakable, some of it. I will allude to it simply by saying Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah condemned some of this last year. This idea that because it's in the name of Imam Hussein we can do as we please, it is not a service to the Ahlul Bayt, it is disservice to them. It is by reading the hadith and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt sincerely that we will be true followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. We have an obligation to promote the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt and share it with others. There is a lot in our hands, we who are not ulama, that cannot be handled by one alim. There is the community leadership. There is the running of our madrasas. There is public media and PR. There is interaction with the government. There is building new institutions and new projects. One alim cannot do everything. But if we at an individual level can elevate the level of our taqwa, then the criteria on which we choose our leadership will change. And here I address my own ethnicity, the Khoja community in particular. Traditionally, we choose leaders, and I don't speak for Masumin Center here. I have the deepest love and devotion for Bashir Bhai. But traditionally, in other parts outside Canada as well, we choose our leaders on the basis of who has the time. Whoever is self-employed, whoever is the good administrator, whoever has a social standing, and this is not bad, but it must be coupled with the issue of taqwa. So that the decisions that are made in guiding the community are based on this. Because as I mentioned, this is how Imam Ali chose his governors as well. He said, I will not choose those who have political experience first. I will choose those who have taqwa first. Now, at a communal level, we need to hold on to the ulama. And as I said, I'm going to go over time tonight, and I know tomorrow is a working day. But this is very important, and I apologize to you, but please bear with me. At a communal level, we need to hold on to the ulama. We have got this wrong. We seem to think that the alim has to hold on to us. The unspoken perception is that Ayatollah Sistani needs to learn English, and he needs to come to Canada if he cares enough about us. Okay? The Kaaba doesn't come to you, you go to the Kaaba. If the Imam was here today, he wouldn't come here, you would go to the Imam. Okay? Now, the conclusion we make is that because he doesn't care about us, therefore we don't care about him. He only wants our khums money, so we're going to cut ourselves loose and we're going to fend for ourselves. You don't become arrogant when you are in need. You see, sometimes your child stands up in arrogance and say, I don't need you, Baba. But the moment he goes to the washroom and needs to be washed, then he realizes how much in need he is. The moment he's hungry, the moment he gets hurt and needs a band-aid, all that arrogance falls apart. He becomes humble and realizes. He doesn't realize, he does it the same the next day. But for that moment, there is a revelation. So suddenly all that big talk of we have our own intellectuals and we can guide ourselves begins to fall apart. The problem with the past leaders of Islam is that they saw Islam as something that was limited to the Middle East and the Arabs versus non-Arabs and resources of oil. They couldn't see that universality of Islam that would overtake all of humanity. We have the same problem. A lot of times when we think as Khojas, we are thinking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I'm asking you to think 100 years, 500 years from now. Where do we see ourselves as a community if we cut ourselves from marja'iyat and begin doing our own thinking? Where do we see ourselves 500 years from now? It's like a boat. Think of it as a small boat we're in and we're being pulled by a steamer. And that steamer is marja'iyat. And we come to one point and saying, you know what, they don't care about us. We're doing our own thing. We're managing fine. Let's cut ourselves loose. Initially, because we are riding in the waves of that steamer, we think we're doing fine, first 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Eventually, when that disappears out of sight, and we look around, and we're just bobbing in the ocean now, and there's just water all around, and sharks going around us, now we will scream for that steamer, but it'll be too late. All right? So, as Khojas, we have made great sacrifices in changing from Hinduism to Ismailism to become Shia Ithna Ashari. And we take pride in that. But we cannot rest on those laurels. The Muhajirun and Ansar also made great sacrifices, but some of them changed after the Prophet and betrayed the trust that he had given them, which is why within 50 years they killed his grandson. So we, because of the sacrifices we made, does not mean we are insulated. I spoke to an elder of the Khoja community not too long ago, and he was giving me an example of how, you know, when we moved from India, some Shias went to Fiji and some went to the Caribbean, and we went to East Africa, and they all went astray, and they had the Hosei festival and all this, and we are the only ones who held onto Islam and the right path and Tashayyu. And I said, wait a minute, there is a difference though. When they went there, they were already Shias, they were already Sayyids, and they went as Shias. When we came, many of us were not Shias, were Hindus and Ismailis. We changed and became reverts. What held us was not that there was something special about us. It was the fact that we were reverts. And as a revert, our faith was very near and dear to us. And that was the reason why we held onto the faith so well. And that was the reason why everywhere we went, the first thing we did is we built a masjid, we built a Husayniyah, and we built a madrasa, bihamdillah. But it doesn't mean that now that we have established ourselves as Shia and we migrate to other lands, we will continue to hold to our faith as we did before. We are now very capable of doing the same thing that those we point fingers at in the Caribbean and in other parts. As a community, what I am hearing is that we don't want to be patronized by the ulama. We have survived for many decades with our own local mullahs, and we are very capable of continuing to do so. We don't need a Maulana from India or Iraq or anyone telling us what to do. What I am hearing is that finding the truth in Islam is like buying a car. You can Google for the answer. And this disturbs me very, very much. Because if you search on Google, which car should I buy, and you end up buying the wrong car, the worst that will happen is you won't be comfortable. It won't provide your need. You might have to exchange it for a better one. Or you might have to put up with it for 10 years before you buy another wrong car by mistake, which is what we all do. But if you're going to use Google to find something on which your salvation depends, and you pick the wrong answer, now your eternal life is at stake. We cannot be drawing such analogies and such parables from the pulpit. So, the need for ulama remains. The issue is not whether we need guidance from ulama. It's only about how do we identify the right ulama to follow. We need, as a community to get off that high horse of how special we are despite being a minority, and how well we have done for ourselves, and how we have set up madrasas everywhere we go, and how we are so organized as a world body. The fact of the matter is, we are really just an ethnic community that is disintegrating very quickly outside East Africa and India, and unless our faith is front and center, it will not survive. And that faith that we need to follow cannot be our own customized, liberal, Western value-laden Islam. It must be Orthodox Islam that is open to defining Shiaism on the basis of faith and not on the basis of ethnicity or language or color or race. If we really want to make a Khoja affair of all this, then so be it. Let us use Khoja ulama. But let them be those who connect us to the marja'iyah. We need to plug in. You see, the source of a power doesn't need the device that plugs in. If that device unplugs and cuts itself loose, the source of the power will not even notice it. It's the device that will drain out. So we as a community need to plug in and to make sure we are always plugged in. Our leaders at the highest level, and then our ulama, must be fluent in Arabic and Farsi. They must have direct links to the Maraji, and they must be encouraged to go on frequent visits to share and communicate with our Maraji, and not simply a brief visit and come back and say, Ayatollah says salam and he remembers you in his du'as. It has to be more than that. When we first wanted to convert as Khojas, we went to Najaf and we asked the Marja of the time to give us an alim who will guide us. And he complied and sent us scholars who came back with us and guided us. We wouldn't have succeeded if we wouldn't have done that. If the problem we face today is the lack of engagement with the ulama and the Maraji, then let us build a center, let us even build an embassy in Najaf and Qum that specifically represents the ulama and the community in the West and acts as ambassadors for us. I'm not asking that we follow the ulama blindly, but I'm asking that instead of trying to determine right action based on values of the society, or instead of relying on our own arrogant sense of pseudo-intellectualism, that we show some humility to the institution of imama as it exists today in the form of marja'iyah. It's impossible for you to have the true context of Islamic values and principles as the person who has spent his entire life studying Islam. Furthermore, if we learn to be a little subservient to marja'iyah, it teaches us how to behave with a ma'soom imam as well. Look at the people who opposed Imam Hassan alayhi salam. They followed him, and then when he decided on the peace treaty, they started saying, it doesn't make sense to me. Now, instead of calling him Mu'izzul Mu'mineen, na'udhu billah, they call him Mudhillul Mu'mineen. And they started attacking him. I guarantee you, as a community, if we take this path forward, that we will rely on our own understanding and our own opinion, and it must make sense to me before I comply, we will do the same thing when Imam al-Mahdi returns. So our success as Shias thus far has been on the basis of this deep-rooted idea that the marja is the na'ib of the imam. And our Sunni brothers envy us for this institution of marja'iyah. I was going to give an example of that issue of tobacco and so on, but I don't have the time for that. But if today a marja was to say tobacco is haram, I guarantee you we would not all comply. The first question would be, what about e-cigarettes? Right? And then the second question would be, well, that tobacco that the British are exploiting is in Iran. What if I'm having tobacco from South America? Right? We are driven with this mindset of questioning, which is a good thing, but we also have this attitude of, being au contraire and just opposing things for the sake of. Now, the liberals amongst us say, we will pick and choose, but they, I am sorry to say, are often not qualified to do that. We do all these projects around the world to say we are awakening the community. We drink all this Kool-Aid on the Western ideas of democracy and free speech. And then we go to the grassroots of all the Jamaats and we say, what change do you want? And the people say, get rid of the mimbar, we want only the podium. Get rid of the barrier between the men and women, let's sit together. Right? Nice ideas. We don't want one person sitting and talking to us because he doesn't know time limit, he just goes on and on. We want interaction and dialogue. Right? Okay, that last one is a good point, but we go asking disgruntled seniors, inexperienced youth and teenagers, and often wealthy, liberal-minded, who don't know the alif from the ba, to tell us whether Sharia is important and what needs to stay in the community and what shouldn't stay in the community. We are only interested in intellectual debates. We're not interested in Sharia. And there is a form of pseudo-intellectualism and pseudo-spirituality that has become prominent in the community. And these sort of feedbacks, without guidance from a scholar, is dangerous. A recent debate that has gone on in the Khoja community is, let's not ban anyone from the mimbar. Because we are intellectuals, mashallah, let anyone speak, because it's good for us. We say this is the university of Imam Hussein, isn't it? So it's a university, let it be a university, let everyone come and talk. Now I am asking if this is the right platform. I'm not against listening to opinion of everyone, but look around how many children there are. Do I want someone to sit on this pulpit and tell my child that if something doesn't make sense to you, you don't have to follow it? Do I want someone sitting here and telling my child that Allah doesn't care whether you fold your hands or you put your hands down? Then what was the Prophet saying when he said, Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli, pray exactly the way you see me praying, right? So there is a time and a place for everything. But this idea that we don't need ulama is wrong. Because then I'll say, well, if it doesn't matter whether your hands are up or down, then why should we even do ruku and sujood? Let's just sit and meditate like Buddhists and find Allah that way, right? Why stop at anything then? So being receptive to the truth and other opinions is one thing, but being naive and foolish and throwing our children's salvation to the dogs is quite another thing. There is jahala, jahal basit, simple ignorance, where I don't know, but I know I don't know. And then there is jahal murakkab, compounded ignorance, where not only do I not know, but I don't even know that I don't know. And the enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. The clear sign of our hubris and arrogance is that we cannot be bothered with learning Arabic or going back to see the centuries of research done or the chain and hierarchy through which knowledge has come to us. We just throw it all off like an old shirt and we say, God doesn't care whether you pray this way or that way, or you do wudu like this or you do wudu like that. I will just read an English translation of the Quran. I will write my own thoughts on the margins, and then egged on by the Zionists and the enemies of Islam, I'll write a book called The Trouble with Islam, and I'll go to media and public with it, and go to town with it. Muslims may not be scholars, but there is one thing that they are very good at smelling out, and that is someone who speaks in a vacuum versus someone who remains faithful to Orthodox Islam, and then calls for reform and revival from within Islam. Our challenge today is to resist the temptation of following leaders who build a cult-like insulated community that hangs on to every word he says on one hand, versus the other extreme where we forsake the right ulama and marja'iyah on the other, and we suppose that we'll figure the way forward on our own. I do concede that part of the problem is the silence of the right ulama. If they don't step up in a timely fashion, and they don't condemn wrong practices, and they don't call out the elephant in the room, and they don't show the courage to say things that need to be said, then people continue to guess and try to figure out whom they should follow and whom they should not follow. I am almost done, and I thank you again for your patience. But as you can tell, this is important, and I will not repeat this, nor will I have that opportunity. Now, this is the reason why I say we need to identify the ulama that we need to follow. And besides the obvious qualities that an alim should have, like ilm and taqwa, there are three qualities that I always talk about. And I have been condemned for this on other platforms, that I'm dissing the ulama, but I have looked at this again and again, and these qualities stand out to me. Courage, humility, and sincerity. This is, besides taqwa, ilm, all that is there. Ala ra'si wa aini. But an alim should have the courage to say the truth when it needs to be said. An alim should be sincere and not show double standards. And an alim has to be humble and not show we ulama this, we ulama that. Humility has to be there. When we speak of, for example, Sheikh Zakzaki in Nigeria, or we speak of Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, for example, these are not mujtahideen. But why do we admire them? We admire them because besides knowledge and taqwa, they have these qualities in them. And this is how you look at the communities. They have transformed the Shia communities that is under their guidance. You will see, for example, hijab is observed almost 100% in their communities. right? Their community listens and obeys them. They are absolutely united, not in a blind fashion. They have good understanding of their faith, but they are subservient to the commands and orders of their leaders. And these are the communities that we can say will truly take their communities and hand it to Imam al-Mahdi with pride and say, these are Shias ready to serve your cause. So we need to take guidance from the right ulama, and we need to submit to Allah instead of taking guidance from our own desires and submitting to our egos. Let us also beware of extremists who rally around one individual in a closed and insulated manner. And let us beware of reformists who call for reform in a vacuum with no deep understanding of Islam and without the necessary approvals from our highest authorities. Let us not be naive and say it doesn't matter who sits on the mimbar, because it does. Let us always be under the guidance of our most trusted scholars, and let us empower our ulama, even in the West here, and encourage them to speak with courage. A lot of times they don't, because they don't feel they have the trust from us, the community. Let us say to our ulama locally, we have got your back. Tell us what you truly believe is the right way forward, and we will support it. They should not operate from a perspective that my community will resist the change I'm trying to make. And if figuring things out forward on our own is still appealing to us, then I have two questions to ask to my reformist brothers. One, why are we arguing with the Sunnis that the Prophet appointed a successor? They are saying that the Prophet did not appoint a successor, and he left it to the Ummah to figure out on their own what is the right way forward. If we are arguing we don't need marja'iyah, then are we not saying the same thing? You might say that, well, it's different because imams are ma'soom, and when we argue with our Sunni brothers, we are asking about the imams. Here we are talking about fallible beings when we talk about the maraji and the ulama. But my argument is, are not these marajis the ones who know the most about the imams and their guidance? Or who knows more? Is it them, or is it that liberated, pluralistic, modern Jamaat member who knows the best and is the best judge? And it boils down to asking ourselves as a community, what is it that binds us? Is it our faith or our culture? Are we first Shias and then Khoja, or are we first Khoja and then Shia? And the second point is, if really we can figure things on our own, then why do we even need Imam al-Mahdi to come? We can brainstorm ideas on our own, isn't it? So what was once unimaginable, questioning the Maraji and objecting to their views, has now become a common habit. And when the Imam comes, we will do the same. You might say, well, when he comes, I won't because he's a ma'soom. But I ask you, look at Surah Al-Hujurat. Surah Al-Hujurat, there's all the ayats about how to obey the Prophet. Don't raise your voice above his voice. Don't leave his presence without his permission. People have asked questions that now that the Prophet has gone, are these verses outdated? Are they history now? Is there any relevance to them? The relevance to them is that Allah is also teaching us how to obey a leader. Because when you respect a leader, when you respect the rightful alim, you don't raise your voice above him, you don't leave his presence without permission, you are strengthening him and thereby strengthening yourself and your community. It is like the father of a family. If you disrespect the father in your family, you are hurting yourself, you're stabbing yourself, you're weakening yourself. So when we look at improving the community and the way forward, let us think as Shias globally. Let us think da'wah. Let us think ummah. Let us think Shia and Sunni. Let's not think in a bubble and say Khoja Shia of East Africa. Because if we lose our identity as Khojas, but we attain salvation and inshallah join the Ahlul Bayt in Jannah, then we have still succeeded. But if we remain as Khojas and lose our faith, then what have we gained? And I ask this question to some of my communities outside Canada as well. Why are we so keen to join hands, for example, with the Ismailis only because they are Khojas, but not so keen to join hands with the Shias who are ethnically different, whether they are black, brown, yellow, or anything? So, as a conclusion, I want to make a prediction, and in case you are still worried, it is only half of this and half of this, okay? I want to make salawat alayhi. Trust me, if I wasn't reading from the paper, this would have been twice as long. I want to make a prediction of where I see Muslims in the West 20 or 30 years from now if we don't hold onto the ulama and seek the Quran and Ahlul Bayt through them, the right ulama. This is my prediction. and it will be heard even if I am no longer here. The followers of true Orthodox Islam will be isolated from mainstream society. They will live in small pockets of their own, very much like the Amish do today. They will be seen as a quaint group that is backward and out of touch with reality and impractical. The majority of Muslims will claim to be Muslims, but what they follow will be far removed from Orthodox Islam. It will be a watered-down version, just like Christianity today is far removed from what Jesus originally preached. The Quraysh claimed to follow Ibrahim, but they filled the Kaaba with idols, buried their daughters alive, and went around the Kaaba naked, and knew nothing about submission to God as Ibrahim did. And so will be the Muslims. They will continue to build magnificent mosques and structures. They will have Muslim names. They will have museums and art and calligraphy of their history. They will continue to promote the Arabic script of the Quran, but in practice they will have none of the values of being submissive to Allah or following the Sharia or upholding its moral values. I want to end by saying, you should look into how Christianity came to be what it is. There is a book called From Jesus to Christ, The Origins of the New Testament Images of Christ by Paula Fredrickson. Dr. Paula Fredrickson is an authority on the Bible. She explains that when St. Paul could not preach to the Jews, he was a Jew and a disciple of Jesus. He wanted to preach to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews, even though Jesus had clearly said he was not sent to the Gentiles. When he came to these Gentiles, he found the thing that they were opposed to was the Sharia of Moses. For example, she says that the Hebrews, the Jews, used to circumcise the men, and the Romans would not circumcise. Now, when they used to work out in their gyms, they used to have these arenas where they would work out like we work out in the gym. The Romans used to work out stark naked. And it was very obvious when the men saw each other, they could tell that they were not circumcised. So some of them were willing to accept his message, but they refused to be circumcised because then they would have been seen and they would stand out. They could not hide that from others. So he began excusing them from these one by one and saying, you know, what is important is to be spiritual. What's important is to be good. You don't have to do this. You don't have to be that. And then he finally said that these rabbis are all hypocrites. They emphasize on Sharia, and to borrow an example from Islam, that's so particular about how you do wudu and so particular about salat, but in their heart there is only nifaq and there is no sincerity. What is important is to be good. So then the Sharia just dropped. And when you look at the Jews as well, you have Orthodox, you have the liberal. We are headed in the same direction because we have this idea that we are now of an age where we need to look at spirituality and intellectual debates, and we don't need Sharia and we don't need ulama, and this is outdated. But then we will move away from Islam. You heard this hadith very quickly, two short hadith, and I am done. You have heard this hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. He said there will come a time when people will stop doing amr bil ma'ruf and nahi al munkar. Then there will come a time when people will do amr bil munkar and nahi anil ma'ruf. And then there will come a time when people will actually think ma'ruf is munkar and munkar is ma'ruf. I believe this is the time we are in. If we do not immediately arrest the situation, identify the right ulama, and take back that solid connection we have to imama and adala through the marja'iyah, then we are headed in that direction. There is a hadith that the Shias have that says when the Mahdi returns, he will bring a new Quran and a new Islam. I ask you, is there a new Quran coming? No. Is there a new Islam coming? No. What does this hadith mean? What this hadith means is that Muslims will have lost the original Quran and Islam to such an extent that when he presents Islam and Quran, it will seem as if it is a new Quran and a new Islam. And now I end with the verses of Quran that I promised that I have been reading every single night from Surah Al-Imran. Verse 103 says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Hold on to the rope of Allah and do not separate. And the Prophet has told us what this rope is. He said, hold on to Quran and my itra. You will never go astray because these two are inseparable. وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ. Remember the favors of Allah on you, O Muslims, Shia and Sunni. إِذْ كُنْتُمْ أَعْدَاءً فَأَلَّفَ بَيْنَ قُلُوبِكُمْ. When you are enemies to each other, and He brought your hearts together. فَأَصْبَحْتُمْ بِنِعْمَتِهِ إِخْوَانًا. So that you have now developed love and become brothers. And I hope this series of lectures will not divide us, but the Masumin Center as well will be that conduit where, as Shias and Sunnis, that love and brotherhood will foster. وَكُنْتُمْ عَلَى شَفَى حُفْرَةٍ مِّنَ النَّارِ. You were on the brink of the fire of hell, or some say that this nar is war and harb. فَأَنْقَذَكُمْ مِنْهَا. And He saved you from this fire. And then in this way, Allah, كَذَلِكَ يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ آيَاتِهِ لَأَلَّكُمْ تَهْتَدُونَ. In this way, Allah makes His revelations clear to you so that you may be guided. The verse after that, 104, just in English, says, be a community that calls to good, urges what is right, and forbids what is evil. Those who do this shall be the successful ones. And then the final verse, chapter 3, verse 105 says, do not be like those who, after they had been given clear revelation, they split into factions and they fell into disputes. A terrible punishment awaits such people. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. If you can recite one more salawat ala Muhammad wa ala محمد وآل محمد.